Welcome to the Gym Challengers. My name is Gym Leader Geo, and welcome to the first episode of Geo Teaches Trainers. In this series, I aim to help trainers of all skill levels learn to hone and practice and perfect specific skills that will help them become more competitive Pokemon battlers. Today's video is going to be an important one because it's going to be the foundation of a lot of the future GTTs on this channel, and I'm going to be referring back to it pretty frequently in my other videos. The skill we're going over today is team building. Now, this subject is super complex, crazy diverse, and totally unique to each player's play style, which is why I'm going to be really general with this. I'm going to go over a lot of the important considerations that people should be making in team building, which are the right Pokemon to choose for a team, general facts about team building, where to get more information, things like that. My goal with GTT is not to handhold you through putting together a team of 6 Pokemon. It's to make sure that when you're in the team building process, you're giving due consideration to different things that will help make your team more competitive. So really, the goal of this entire video is to help you guys figure out how to design a team that works for you using Pokemon you like that will function in a competitive environment. So here's a list of the few points I'm going to be going over in this video. You can either watch this video all the way through to get the full picture, or if there's specific things you want to learn about or you want to fast forward to, you can just use this table of contents as a fast forward mechanism. So just go ahead and click any of these annotations to fast forward to that subject. But let's get started right at the beginning here. How do I start building my team? How do I conceptualize my team? You can do this in a lot of different ways. One thing you can do is pick a favorite Pokemon and start from there. Another way is to start with a core, an offensive or defensive core, and try and find Pokemon that fill the gaps that you need for building a team with that. Another thing you could do is think of team types, the style of play you want your team to be doing overall. You can do a threat assessment, lots of different ways to handle this, and I'm going to go into each of these sort of mannerisms a little bit more specifically right now. First of all, I'm going to start with favorite Pokemon because this is a very common way that some people, particularly players on Pokemon Showdown who like to ladder battle, like to build some of their teams. So if you're building a team around a favorite Pokemon, you need to first know what that Pokemon's role is in the environment. Is this Pokemon a late game sweeper? Is it a mid game sweeper? Is it a bulky offensive pivot, a support, or a wall, or a tank, or something like that? And the goal around building a team this way is to be really concerned with what is the drawback to this Pokemon, what's stopping it from doing the things you want it to do. Now, this could be almost anything. I'm going to start with some of the really popular Pokemon, some of the most overused Pokemon, before I start getting a little bit more specific. Right now, Aegislash is the #1 used Pokemon in the metagame, according to Smogon's usage statistics. And obviously, this can change a little bit if you're depending on what game system you're looking at. You could be looking at Pokemon Showdown, which is what Smogon is primarily using. You could be only talking about Road to Ranked, and that would influence things a little bit too. The important thing to consider is that Aegislash is popular in both, and it's also used in doubles. I should also mention I'm primarily talking about singles battle in this video. So if you wanted to build an entire team around Aegislash, you'd first need to know, what do you want to do with Aegislash? Is Aegislash going to be a special sweeper, a physical sweeper? Are you going to be aiming to set up with Swords Dance? Once you've figured out the set for your Aegislash, you need to start looking for its weaknesses. Now, a special Aegislash is kind of the more common set right now. It doesn't require a whole lot of setting up and can catch people really off guard. The physical sets, however, that very threat of a physical set can draw a lot of people to end up losing a Pokemon to you. And this is where a really big part of making team cohesion around a favorite Pokemon comes into play. If you were building a team around Aegislash, for example, and you're running a physical set, chances are you're going to need someone who can handle the physical walls that Aegislash has a hard time getting around. Defensive fire types, for example, are a big issue. Heatran in general is a great counter. So if you're building a team around one specific Pokemon, the next consideration, the very next consideration, should be 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 Pokemon that very, very adequately cover all of his checks. Doing this style of team building, generally speaking, will result in you putting together a team functioning around your favorite Pokemon being your late game sweeper, usually. And that's because you're going to spend a majority of the game trying to get your opponent to switch in your Aegislash counters so that you can kill them and then get Aegislash in safely and have him sweep with impunity. Now that's, generally speaking, the thought process that goes behind building a team around a favorite Pokemon. Another idea is starting with a core. So, two different ways to do this, obviously. You could start with your defensive core. Here are my 2 defensive Pokemon or 3 defensive Pokemon, and having them in a team, what offensive Pokemon can most benefit from having these guys in here. So, if you, like in the example I provided earlier, if you were building a team around an Aegislash, if you started instead with, well, I really want a specially defensive Heatran, immediately you're going to know, okay, this guy walls Aegislash. So you could bring, at that point, Pokemon that benefit well from Aegislash being walled. Just an example. And so starting off with your defensive core, you should also sort of decide what's the role of the defensive core you're aiming to bring. Are you just bringing one physical wall and one special wall? Are you bringing an elemental core? That's a fire, water, grass Pokemon. Are you bringing a regenerator core? Regenerator core is a good one to talk about because you will start seeing these with semi-regularity, especially if you play on Pokemon Showdown. A regenerator core is 2 defensive Pokemon. Traditionally, it's Slowbro and Amoonguss, or Tangrowth and Slowking. And those 2 cover each other's type weaknesses pretty well, almost perfectly, and also benefit from the fact that they can switch in, not lose too much momentum having to navigate around keeping their own health up, and can switch out to regenerate a lot of their lost health. It's a really strong technique that for physical and special defensive cores that doesn't lose you a lot of momentum, which is traditionally a problem with using dedicated walls. Pokemon who don't have great offensive presence when they're in, and that's something that's very common for Tangrowth. Usually the best thing it does to sort of threaten Pokemon in and out is with its Leech Seed, because its attacks are they're not so hot. So, especially if you're specializing in their defensive stats. So there's also Intimidate cores. I'm not really going to go into those. That's a much deeper concept that's usually revolves around building Pokemon, primarily specially defensive, but running a lot of Intimidators, so anytime a physical Pokemon comes in, the corresponding switch will lower their attack. That's a general... again, these are all just general team building strategies that some people use going into team building process. A lot of people, and this is really the point of this video that I'm trying to avoid, will get beaten by a Pokemon, decide that that's a scary Pokemon, and put it on their team. The reason this is an issue is, over time you'll start to realize that you've just got a team of 6 Pokemon who are on their own threats, but don't function well without the correct support. Part of the reason people get fully swept, like 6-0 swept by one particular Pokemon, is because that Pokemon had a nice team leading it to the right position to set up for that sweep. Most Pokemon can't just come in turn 1 and beat all 6 Pokemon on a team. That just doesn't happen unless your opponent's team is not well built. It's going to require a lot of prep, usually a couple of turns of prep at least, to take out an entire team if both players are fully IV and EV trained, and that's not something I'm going to be talking about right now. If you are interested in IV or EV training, there's tons of videos up on YouTube right now about that. They can talk about how to do it really quickly with time machine method breeding and super training or horde battle training for EVs. I'm not going to go into that. Maybe I'll make a GTT about it later, but that's not for right now. Another thing to consider when building a team based around a core is building around a mid-game sweeper core as opposed to a physically or specially or your defensive core. If you build a team around your mid-game sweepers, these are the Pokemon, usually you're talking about Volt Turn teams. Now, what a Volt Turn team is a team that functions around having Pokemon that use U-Turn or Volt Switch. It applies continuous momentum because it allows you to see if your opponent is switching in and out, kind of scout the moves they're doing before you switch in their counters. Now, this is where in the past generation, Gen 5, you really saw a huge spike in usage of Scizor and of Rotom Wash. Those two formed a really synergistic Volt Turn core. Rotom forces a lot of switches, really strong defensive Pokemon with great offensive presence too. Its typing is incredible, and Scizor had the potential to sweep entire teams. So when he was coming in the mid-game, if he came in on the right Pokemon, you had no choice but to switch out, and he would pick up momentum from that with one of the strongest U-turn, I think the strongest U-turn in the metagame at the time. And that kind of threat of constant momentum from your mid-game sweepers is really what can lead to the decision to make a team based around your mid-game sweeper core. I'm also going to be going over a lot of these terms if they seem a little bit confusing, what a mid-game sweeper is, a late-game sweeper is, in a little bit. So right now I'm just trying to talk about the thought processes that go behind how you start building your team. Another thing to consider is threat assessment. Some people literally build teams entirely to beat certain key threats, and I'm going to go into this a little bit later also. But it is important to consider whether or not your team can handle a lot of the megas that are new to the metagame that are really popular right now. And also some of the banned megas if you're a Smogon player, because if you're playing on GTS, you're not always going to see people following those rules. I personally choose to play by the Smogon rule set. I don't have any problem with people who don't, because the majority of my teams are built to handle a lot of those Pokemon, and yours might need to be too. I'm going to move on now, and we're going to talk about what should I look out for when building teams. So this sort of goes back to what I was talking about just a second ago, key threats to the metagame. There are some Pokemon that are absolutely key to the meta right now. They are defining the top 20 most used Pokemon, in the sense that if you're not running this Pokemon, you need to be running a Pokemon that beats it, or at least has a certain check, or you have an entire team that can mobilize around it, take some advantage back, or force that Pokemon to not generate quite so much momentum. A lot of the time, people will ask, is it right to bring more than one Pokemon just to counter some of these key threats? And that's kind of hard to say. A lot of the time, the best rule of thumb is you bring a counter or a very strong check to those Pokemon, but if that Pokemon gets overworked, for example, if you're putting all of your physical defensive pivot work on your Skarmory, and Skarmory gets taken out because it's your only counter to, say, a Talonflame and an Aegislash, then you're going to run into a big issue in the later game because you're not going to have anyone to answer that. So you need to sort of assess that twice. Are you putting too much pressure on one Pokemon to do all of the work? So I'm going to go over the top 25 threats that just right now, outright, if you build a team, you need to expect that you're going to see these Pokemon, because they're going to be in a lot of your matches. These are the top 25 according to the... I'm going to put this link on the screen. According to Smogon's usage list from, I believe it was March of this year, 2014, these are the top 25 most used Pokemon right now. And that's Aegislash, Rotom Wash, Charizard, B-Sharp, Scizor, Landorus T, Thundurus, Garchomp, Keldeo, Talonflame, Latios, Tyranitar, Azumarill, Conkeldurr, Skarmory, Excadrill, Venusaur, Pinsir, Ferrothorn, Greninja, Gliscor, Chansey, Mandibuzz, and Dragonite. And again, I'll leave that link right on the screen right now so you guys can check that out. These Pokemon are huge threats to the metagame right now, almost all of them, and for their own specific reasons. Aegislash is so hard. Even though he's so predictable, he's a very hard Pokemon to fully counter until you know what he's running. And the danger there being that in order to know what he's running, you need to see several of his moves. Now, you can almost guarantee that he's going to be running King Shield no matter what, but that still leaves 3 move slots that can run a majority of or it can run a very diverse amount of moves. Actually, he's not that diverse, I guess. He's only got maybe 5 or 6 really competitive moves for those 3 slots. But the problem is you don't know whether he's running mixed set, whether he's running physical, or whether he's running special. He might shoot off a special attack really quick. You switch in a special wall and get absolutely devastated by a physical attack. Blissey and Chansey, the 2 of the pink blobs, who are some of the best special walls in the metagame, might switch in after they've seen the shadow ball come out of Aegislash a couple of moves, only to find out a second later that this guy's running Sacred Sword and can all but one-shot your Blissey or Chansey. So that's why he's such a big threat. A big way to counter Aegislash is to get a burn on him if he's physical, or even if he's not. The residual damage helps a lot. He does not have effective and reliable means of recovery, and his moves become pretty predictable. Your best bet against an Aegislash is trying to take back some of the momentum from him by making switches against him when you expect the King's Shield. Your opponent can play around that too, but I just needed to talk about that a second because he's a very important Pokemon to counter in this metagame. Rotom Wash, same style. You never really know what he's going to be throwing at you if your opponent's going to try and keep you on your toes. He can run very effective Resto Chesto sets, super bulky Pokemon, great pivot Pokemon, can hit relatively hard with his Hydro Pumps and his Volt Switches or Thunderbolts. He can leave you with burns with his Will-O-Wisp. I think he learns Pain Split. I think I've seen a Pain Split, but I might be confusing with another Pokemon or something like that. So don't quote me on that one, but don't be surprised if you see it. Trick Rotoms are relatively common. He's got a big answer for everything, and it's really dangerous to switch in walls against him until you know what he's running, especially if he's running Trick. Getting a Scarf tricked onto some of your defensive pivots is not a good thing because then they lose a lot of momentum switching in ever. Charizard, of course, a huge threat right now. Charizard X, the awesome dual typing of Dragon Fire, brings a lot of offensive presence, can run mixed sets, physical sets, often forces switches and can take that free turn for Dragon Dances, which makes him even bigger threat. Charizard Y, of course, everyone knows this guy. One of the only reasons that Drought teams are still around, since Ninetales has been dropping in usage recently. Really big threat. Heatran, very similar reason to a lot of the other Pokemons. He's very, very effective special wall, great typing, a great answer to Charizard as long as they're not running Earthquake. Great answer to Aegislash. Very effective special wall, and some people can use that to their advantage and also can run him as what he used to be running a couple of generations ago when he was running primarily specially offensive. B-Sharp also gaining a lot of usage this generation, particularly because Knockoff is so much stronger now. He can put a lot of damage in with his priority sucker punches that are stab, and his knockoffs that can remove items and hit stab and hit so hard while also removing items from a lot of your key threats. He also can come in on expected defogs and take an attack boost because of his move Defiant, or his ability Defiant. Anytime he gets a skill dropped, his attack raises 2 stages. Pretty beast, and that's why he's seeing so much use recently. He's easy enough to counter if you're prepared for it, but he can gain a lot of momentum if you make one mistake in the game, and that's why he's seeing so much usage. Scizor, of course, in the same light. Choice Band Scizor still puts out a lot of work. Mega Scizor can still put out boosting sets, support sets, offensive and defensive, and so he's really hard to counter. Now you're kind of seeing, I'm taking a lot of time with this one, but you're kind of starting to see a lot of the reason that some of these Pokemon require teams to be built around them, and that's primarily because you need to know what they're doing before you know how to counter them. This comes a lot into knowing the metagame, so these are the Pokemon you should be looking out for, and when you're building your team, make sure that you're referring to this list at least to the top 25. But if you can go down further, you need to make sure that you have an answer to a lot of these Pokemon, and it's not always as simple as making sure you have the right element or the right typing to counter them. It's about knowing knowing the metagame and knowing what your switches will be when these Pokemon kind of come in. So let's move on, and I'm going to talk now about important jobs. Now, this is really where I'm going to start talking more about specifically choosing Pokemon to be on your team in the team building process. Is your team going to run hazards? This is an important consideration. Teams don't need hazards. The game has slowed down a lot from the 5th gen hyper offense metagame where walls were really just short-lived things. Stall teams had a really hard time getting going. Not saying that they couldn't be used effectively, but they lost a lot of favor because teams just were able to run such high offensive builds, usually largely due to the fact that weather was huge in Gen 5. It's slowed down a lot now, and hazards become much more of a strategic thing rather than forcing Pokemon to be sacrificed into the hyper offense that used to be prevalent in Gen 5. If you're going to bring a hazard, primarily it's because you want to punish teams that will benefit a lot from switching on you, or as an additional threat check against key Pokemon that your team might have a hard time with. If your team has a hard time with Charizards or Talonflames or Mega Pincers, Stealth Rock is an awesome move to bring. Volcaronas too. I don't know why I didn't. Yeah. These type of Pokemon that are 4 times weak are going to take 50% switching in. This helps so much because some of these Pokemon aren't Talonflame's pretty frail, but some of them aren't the most frail Pokemon out there, and it helps a lot to get that additional damage on there so you can score an OHKO on them with some of your other Pokemon. That's the primary benefit of hazards like Stealth Rock. Spikes takes a lot longer to fully set up, and in addition to Stealth Rock, those two can form a pretty dangerous core for people to switch in and out, and it's going to require some protection of those hazards also. So if you're going to be bringing a Stealth Rocker and a Spiker, make sure you've got some Rapid Spin support, maybe a Bishop to take advantage of the expected defogs, things like that. Make sure you protect your hazards if you're going to be bringing more than one of them. And even if you are only bringing one, it's still a pretty good idea to try and take advantage of Pokemon or of opponents who want to try and take that out. Sticky Web is also worth consideration in this generation. If you're building a team with a Sticky Webber, if you're considering Sticky Web on your team, it shouldn't just be because, well, I want Pokemon to be slower. You need to assess speed tiers. Is it going to be beneficial for you to be bringing a Sticky Webber? A lot of them are not the strongest Pokemon to have on the team right now. Galvantula, he can hit pretty hard with his Compound Eyes Thunder, but other than that, his stats are really a little bit lackluster. He's incredibly frail, and if you're going to be bringing him for Sticky Web support, make sure you've got Pokemon that take a lot of benefit from it. Pokemon who are just barely below certain speed tiers that really give them an edge. Part of the reason that Sticky Web support is so prevalent is that some of the much faster sweepers are also really frail. And if you can take a speed drop on those Pokemon and have some of your slower, bulkier threats outspeed them now, you're going to be winning a lot of one-on-one matchups that maybe you might have lost before. That's the thought process that goes behind bringing some of your hazards. Common hazards for this meta right now, or common hazard users, if you're bringing Sticky Web, you see Shuckles, Spinarak. I really wouldn't recommend, or Ariados. I wouldn't recommend him though, and Galvantula being the big one. Stealth Rockers, you see this all over the place. You really got to be prepared. Assess this during the team threat assessment before the match even starts. You can see it nowadays. It's pretty common on some Mamoswines, lead Mamoswines, lead Landorus. Pretty much any physically bulky Pokemon nowadays brings it. You see it on Donphans, Hippodons. You can see it on Skarmory. Some Gliscors I've even seen bringing it recently. I don't know where that started coming back. Maybe that was just a fluke that I started seeing those. But I saw it on Pokemon Showdown a couple matches in a row, and then I also saw it on GTS, and I was not expecting that. So a lot of those physically defensive Pokemon, it's become a tendency for them to bring Stealth Rock. So that one's a lot harder to predict, seeing Pokemon carrying it. But once you see a Pokemon use it once or twice, you'll pretty much understand that that's gonna be a potential part of their set. So Spikers, I would worry about a lot less. They're traditionally very bulky Pokemon. You see it on Pokemon like I don't even remember his name. Fortress. Skarmory, a very popular spiker. Ferrothorn, another popular spiker. If you see spikes coming out, this is going to be where we get into what I'm talking about in a little bit later. You're going to need some removal. And the last type of entry hazards, toxic spikes. In this metagame, traditionally the most common toxic spikers that you're going to see are going to be, once again, Fortress, Tentacruel. That's pretty much the only... Roserade, I guess, uses it. There's a lot of other Pokemon that can use it, but I'm just talking about the most common threats of the metagame, and those are the ones that you need to be prepared for when you're team building. And if you build a team around those common metagame threats, hopefully you can handle some of the lesser used threats that are maybe lesser used for a reason. We're going to move into immunities. This is a really important thing for momentum. I'm going to talk about momentum in another Geo Teaches Trainers, but I'll just go really briefly over what I mean when I say momentum now. If you can ever make a prediction or a play on your turn that causes your opponent to essentially have a useless turn, you've just generated huge momentum, because you have now essentially earned yourself an extra turn to completely complete your strategy that your opponent did not get, because they just threw away a turn, whatever, using Volt Switch on a ground type Pokemon or something like that. This is where immunities become really important. They completely waste your opponent's turn. That was just a wash for them. Nothing good came from that. Key immunities that everyone knows about, the traditional immunities, Psychic on a dark type, Electric on a ground type, Ground on flying type, Poison on steel type, Dragon on fairy, those type of things. We all know about those immunities. And other important immunities to consider are type immunities to common statuses that you get passed around. Like Will-O-Wisp has become pretty important in this generation for neutralizing some of the really powerful threats that you see out there. Burns on, your Excadrills and your dragons and stuff like that. So running fire-type Pokemon is a really helpful way to absorb those incoming Will-O-Wisps without taking a huge detriment to your team. You also have your Sap Sippers and your Grass types and Powder Goggles to absorb the spores and the sleep powders that you might see from Vivians and Beautiflies and stuff like that. And these are really important things to consider if you are playing against teams who are totally fine just putting every one of your Pokemon to sleep. Again, a lot of us who play Smogon aren't necessarily prepared for that, because it's sort of a gentleman's rule and understanding that you only put one Pokemon to sleep at a time. It's something called the sleep clause. Part of the reason that we're pro of sleep clause mechanics is that it helps to make the game a little bit more competitive. Not everybody plays that way, and if that's the case, you need to make sure that you're bringing Pokemon who can handle that. So big grass type Pokemon's in the metagame right now that can handle a lot of these types of moves that are getting thrown at them. You see Breilooms, Amoonguss, Roserades, Sap Sippers on Pokemon like Goodra, although usually people run Gooey on Goodra, usually, but I mean there's a first time for everything. I actually utilize a Goodra in one of my teams. I'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe in another video. But these are really important things to consider. Is that really important to your team? Does your team have a glaring grass weakness? Does it have a glaring weakness to sleep effects? Be prepared to bring grass Pokemon if that's the case. You've got your steel types to absorb incoming poison type attacks, great partners for fairies, and the two of those types of Pokemon put together make hell for dragon, and that's why you're going to start seeing Garchomp dropping in usage a lot in the future of this meta. Electric type attacks obviously are there to absorb paralysis. You cannot paralyze these lightning type Pokemon. So another thing to consider is natural cure or clerics right for your team, and that's gonna be Pokemon like in this metagame right now. The important clerics to be considered of are Blissey's, Chansey's, Florges, Clefable. I just had a stroke. What's that? Umbreon, Sylveon, Pokemon like that. Pokemon that can take a hit, come in, pop off a heal bell or an aromatherapy, and then switch out. Other important jobs for your team, boosters are a really important way to navigate around full stall. If you can buy a turn or two to set up, a lot of the time Pokemon who run stally tactics, Pokemon like Gliscor, really aren't going to want to take a hit without a substitute or whatever from a Pokemon who set up a couple of Swords Dances or Nasty Plots or Dragon Dances or what have you. So boosters, is that right for your team? Is that going to help you break through some of the walls that give problems to some of your late game sweepers? Talonflames are able to run Choice Scarf, for example, but they typically don't in favor of immediate out the gate power that they get from their priority Brave Birds and stuff like that. So if that's the case, you might need a bulkier Pokemon who has the opportunity to set up a couple of boosts to really wall break, and maybe they'll get forced out a little bit later by some other Pokemon, but it's an important role to consider if that's right for your team. Phasing is a term that you might see thrown around a lot. What phasing means is pseudo hazing. The P is for pseudo, and hazing. The purpose of phasing is to remove some of the boosting effects that you see a lot of other Pokemon do. Now, it's sometimes really dangerous if you start letting a Pokemon get too many boosts. They can sweep through an entire team, and all that took was 2 misplays, or 1 turn of a misplay and 1 turn of hacks. Maybe you were like, oh, I'll just burn him and everything will be fine, and you miss your Willow. A phaser is someone who either uses Whirlwind, Roar, or Haze, or Psycho Shift or something to completely remove those benefits from that Pokemon. You might even see people throw the term phaser around when you're talking about Pokemon who are unaware, Pokemon like Quagsire or some Clefables that run it who are not impacted by a Pokemon's boosts at all. So you let your Dragonite get 3 boosts up on you, or maybe he gets a Dragon Dance off and you activate Weakness Policy, and now he's going to start running through your team, except that all those boosts mean nothing to a Quagsire. So things to consider if you need a phaser on your team, or if you need a response to those type of boosting Pokemon. Those are the type of Pokemon you want to consider, and I'll show a couple of those on the screen also. Another thing to consider is Rapid Spin and Defog support. Now, I talked about this a little bit earlier. Hazards can really influence your team build. If you're running a lot of Pokemon that are weak to hazards, you might need to consider completely reformatting some of the Pokemon on your team. If not, you need to make sure that you have ways to stop hazards from getting set up. Magic Bouncers, of which typical ones are Absol, Mega Absol, that is, Espeon, or Zaytu. Or you're going to need Pokemon who can remove those hazards easily. Rapid Spin and Defog are the 2 moves that do that. Another way is to switch in Poison type Pokemon on Toxic Spikes. That's another way to remove those type of threats. And which one is right for you is an important question to ask yourself. Rapid Spin is great for keeping your hazards up and removing theirs. Defog just removes everything. Defog is absolutely perfect if you're bringing none, or if you don't have any set up yet. And Rapid Spin, of course, has the benefit of leaving yours up, but has the de-benefit of being a move that is completely immune, or does not hit Ghost type. So if your opponent brought a Ghost type, you're not going to be able to get off your Rapid Spin unless it's performed by someone with Scrappy. So These type of things need to be considerations in your team building too. Are hazards an issue for you? If your entire team is resistant to hazards, they're probably not. And if your opponent wanted to waste a turn using hazards, that's essentially a useless turn for them, and you just generated momentum. Another thing to be considerate of. So make sure you've given thought process, and it's a really important thing to have in your team if you're going to be running any sort of balance on your team and want to protect some of the other Pokemon that are really weak to Stealth Rocks. I'm going to go over now what the Pokemon Roles are. I've thrown around a lot of terms, and I realize that might have been a little bit confusing to some of the other people that haven't heard them before. So I'll go over these one at a time. I've thrown around the term Sweeper. What a Sweeper is an offensive Pokemon who will, once in, aim to do as much damage as possible trying to kill Pokemon. Now, some people run teams of nothing but sweepers, a full 6 sweeper team. That team would be called a hyper offense team. You've got Pokemon whose only job ever is to get in and do as much damage as possible. That is their goal. And usually once these Pokemon start getting weak or dead, then they're off, and you bring in a new one and you rinse and repeat. Now, this is a very viable strategy, but it's also pretty easy to work around. These Pokemon don't like to be switching in and out a lot. They don't want to ever waste turns not doing as much damage as possible. But that's the idea of a sweeper, and there's different kinds of roles that these sweepers can fill. You have a mid-game sweeper, you have a late-game sweeper, and you have your very rare early offense Pokemon. A mid-game sweeper's job is to have great move pool diversity to sort of get a lot of Pokemon to switch in and out. You can make great predictions and take out or weaken some of the Pokemon in the mid-game. So early game, of course, we're talking about your leads and the first couple of turns surrounding that. That's traditionally focused around winning a weather war, getting your specific weather set up, getting your hazards up, preparing the match for the mid-game. The mid-game is where you start getting some of your offensive Pokemon in, you start trying to whittle down some of your other Pokemon. Mid-game sweepers will get kills sometimes, but their real job is to weaken the entire team. Your late-game sweeper is a Pokemon that can come in, they're traditionally very fast, or once they get a boost, they can finish a game. And late game sweepers' job is to finish off everything that's still alive that they possibly can. And a lot of the time, in order for a late game sweeper to do their job, the mid game sweepers or the early game offensive or support Pokemon need to have done theirs. A lot of end game sweepers that you might hear people talk about that are popular in this meta need a little bit of help. They have very obvious counters and threats that need to be removed before they can really do their job, but they're traditionally very fast Pokemon that hit pretty hard. Talonflame is a great late game sweeper, also a pretty good mid game sweeper too, but that's something I might need to go into a little bit more in a different video, because this one's getting a little bit long, so I apologize for that. Defensive Pokemon, this one is where we get a little bit more convoluted, because there's different ways that Pokemon work about being defensive, but I'll do my best to make sure that the terms get explained here. There's walls, tanks, bulky offense, and pivots. A wall is someone whose job is to completely stop another Pokemon from doing anything worthwhile at all. Traditionally, walls have ways of recovery. If they don't have ways of recovery, they're usually called bulky, or they're usually called tank Pokemon. A wall has a means of recovery. Common walls in this metagame, on the special side, you wouldn't go 2 steps without hearing about Chansey and Blissey. They are the pink blobs of doom. They have incredible health pools and special defense. A lot of special attackers have a really hard time getting through them. The ones that function the best are Pokemon like Alakazam and Mega Alakazam, some of the Latioses or Latias who run Psyshock. Psyshock is a great way to counter those Pokemon. Another way is to just wall break with Nasty Plots or Tail Glows from Manaphy and just burst right through their defenses. But it's a hard thing to do. They can stall, and they can generate a lot of momentum for your team if you're wasting time trying to take them out with special attacks. It just doesn't work a lot of the time. Same thing with physical walls. They can wall certain threats, like you switch a Skarmory in on a Scizor, for example. That Scissor's not going anywhere unless he starts popping some Swords Dances, and even then he might just get phased out by a Whirlwind by the Skarmory. This is a perfect example of what a wall is. Someone that you're not getting by. You're not getting by that wall. The term tank refers traditionally to Pokemon who have bulk on both sides of the scale. So Cresselia, for example, has really high defense and special defense. Rotom, another Pokemon, really high defense and special defense. Those are tanks. A lot of the time they don't have super reliable recovery. Resto Chesto is not considered super reliable because you only get it once. That'd be like saying that you get recovery just because you have a citrus berry. It just doesn't work like that. Or calling leftovers reliable recovery, another thing that doesn't work. Traditionally, these Pokemon, you can't really call them walls except in very specific circumstances. Like I would call Heatran a wall. He very effectively shuts down a lot of special attackers, and even though he doesn't have the greatest recovery options available to him. Bulky offense. This is where you start seeing Pokemon who are offensive threats but are equipped with, I don't know, Assault Vest and things like that. And you have your pivots, who are Pokemon who you cycle in and out based on circumstance. So that's where you start getting your Pokemon like Rotom W, who can take a hit. Great pivot Pokemon because you can switch in the right circumstance, not take that much damage, and Volt Switch out and gain some momentum. Those are the terms that you can see get thrown around when you're referring to defensive Pokemon. Then you have your support Pokemon. A support Pokemon is someone who pops hazards, someone who is a cleric or a wish passer, so their job is to remove status from your team with Heal Bell or Aromatherapy, things like that, or wish passers. So they pop a wish, switch out to a Pokemon that needs some health back, and boom, you just gave some recovery to a Pokemon that otherwise wouldn't have it. Traditional clerics and wish passers are ones I mentioned earlier. Umbreon, Sylveon, Clefable, the Pink Blobs, Florges, Pokemon like that. And the final support, you don't see that much anymore. You might have seen a couple of videos on YouTube that of players who just completely decimate teams with a baton pass team, and that's the last kind of support, and I wouldn't worry too much about that. Certainly don't build your teams around trying to counter those, because a lot of the time, if they just navigate and they play really well, they might get it off, but usually you're going to have an answer. Baton pass teams are dangerous because you need to start the baton pass chain really early in order to maximize the effectiveness, because once your opponent gets going, it's hard for you to start setting up baton passes. They have too much threats going. They have too many hazards on the field. Too many threats. We're able to get a free switch in, and if they're able to get off, their whirlwinds or whatever, it starts becoming really dangerous to be running your baton passes there. So, don't worry too much about that in your team building process. Usually, that all sort of sorts itself out on its own. So let's put this all together. I've talked about a lot of different terminology and thought processes that should go behind making your team, but ultimately, how do we put it all together? You hear a word thrown around a lot called synchrony. Everyone loves and hates that word. Some Pokemon have great synchrony. They work well together. Now, that's true, but you can't just say, like, oh, this team has synchrony. It's too broad, so that's why you hear a lot of people from the Smogon forums complain about that word in Rate My Team, because it's an oversimplified, these two Pokemon have great synchrony. Well, why? Do they specifically hard counter each other's weaknesses? Like a big combo or a big duo that's known to have good synchrony, for example, would be Tangrowth and Slowking. They're great because if you see an incoming fire type attack against your Tangrowth, who you're going to switch in? You're going to switch in his best friend, the other part of the regenerator duo, Slowking. He's going to eat that up. It's not very effective against him. Oh, perfect. What great synchrony. That's why you're going to see that stuff thrown around. But you need to be careful with that because you need to assess what all your weaknesses are specifically. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Make sure you have an answer to all 25 of the top 25 threats. You need to be able to answer every single one of them. If you don't have a single Pokemon on your team that can switch into it or can beat it once it's in, you have not put together a very balanced team. So make sure you have answers to that. All teams are going to have weaknesses, all of them. You can't put together 6 Pokemon that can answer absolutely everything. It just doesn't work like that. You can try your absolute best, but there's going to be issues with things like that. So do your absolute best to have as many answers to as many problems as you can with your Pokemon, but be aware of the Pokemon who give your team issues. And finally, the team types. Be aware of what types of team you're up against so that you know what to expect from them. You should be able to find this in the team preview feature. You should immediately be able to recognize the type of team your opponent's bringing right off the bat. And I'm going to go over the terms right now that you might hear thrown around a lot. And that's a balanced team, an offensive team, a hyper-offensive team, semi-stall, full stall, true stall, and weather, which would be one of those other things listed. A balanced team is traditionally a Pokemon, 2 or 3 defensive Pokemon, 2 or 3 offensive Pokemon, and maybe a support or something like that. Very balanced, you will switch in defensive Pokemon when you need defensive Pokemon, you'll set up hazards if you need hazards, and you have a couple of Pokemon ready to do some offense. Those are balanced teams, and they're very effective, they're very common, and they have a lot of answers to a lot of different things. Very good place to start on your team building. Build yourself an offensive core, build yourself a defensive core, have them mingle, do like the thing, and then throw together a couple of more Pokemon that cover particular weaknesses that those 4 Pokemon or 5 Pokemon would have. An offensive team is skewed a little bit more to one side. You might have a defensive Pokemon or 2, but then the majority of your team is going to function around putting out a lot of pressure. You're going to have your offensive Pokemon in a lot, forcing your opponent on the defensive. So you're going to try and switch in a threat, and as soon as your opponent has to make a switch to get away from that threat, you've immediately generated the momentum you need to be constantly on the offensive. That's an offensive team. You might only carry one special wall who's got to do the job of all the special walls, which is typically why you'll see Chansey on some of these teams, and maybe one physical wall. This is the birth of Skarmbliss that you might remember from Gen 3, 2? That goes way back. Skarmbliss. I forgot about that. I should make a team with Skarmbliss. And then 4 offensive Pokemon who are really going to be putting the hurt out there. You're aiming to make these matches last a lot less number of turns than you would in a balanced team, because you don't have a lot of longevity on an offensive team. A hyper offensive team means you have 6 or 5 purely offensive Pokemon, and these teams are usually made by players who get scared of a few key threats and decide to put them on their team. So maybe they got swept by Mega Kangaskhan on GTS, or they saw a Blaziken somehow get to +6 speed and +2 attack on them after a couple of Swords Dances and Protects, and they're like, oh my god, this guy can do everything, can blow through my entire team. That's usually the type of hyper-offensive teams you'll see, and the traditional way to handle those is to either wall them, get them switching around uselessly, and have them waste a lot of time, or just live through their offense. That's traditionally the way you counter those. You'll see the term semi-stall thrown around a lot, particularly by me, because it's my favorite game style to play. A semi-stall team functions with defensive cores, defensive walls, a couple of tanks, and then a couple of offensive Pokemon. The way a semi-stall works is you try and get your offensive Pokemon in safely, have them do as much work as they can, and then get them out and use your support Pokemon to get them shored up with Heal Bell and Wishes, and have them come back in later and do the same job. You need offensive Pokemon who can handle a majority of the metagame with support in order to do a semi-stall team. You'll see Pokemon like Conkeldurr are very popular on semi-stall teams because they're bulky enough that you're probably not going to be one-shotting them too often. And they're able to stay in, handle their own, and take out even a lot of their counters. If you're not prepared for a Conkeldurr and you get knocked off when you switch in a Gengar, you're going to die, and then you've just lost someone that you thought was your fighting type counter, and etc., etc. So these are the type of Pokemon you need to be expecting on a semi-stall team. Semi-stall teams are very difficult teams to overcome if the team is built well, because their defensive core is very hard to break down, and their offensive Pokemon are going to put in some work to your team if you give them an opportunity to switch in for free. The term full stall requires to a strategy that functions around setting up stall tactics. Now, a semi-stall, they have the ability to stall you if they want to, if maybe your team is so well built that they don't have any other options, or if your opponent is just making really good switches. They don't have a choice. They have to stall you. They have to play games with you by getting you to force a lot of switches in Stealth Rock, or to set up other types of hazards, to spread a lot of like Toxic or Burn on your team and whittle down your opponent. Full stall, that's all they do. That is all they want to do, is get poison on everybody, whittle you down, and maybe a full stall will carry an offensive Pokemon or two. Usually they do, but if you watch a full stall team, they'll start off right out of the gate with some hazards, and then they will do nothing but switch in defensive Pokemon on your offensive Pokemon. And then as soon as they can predict a switch and get one of their offensive Pokemon in, then they might try and take advantage of all of the turns that they force you to waste with their defenses. But that's full stall. Their strategy comes from making you waste time and whittle your own Pokemon down against them. They will carry Heal Bell or Aromatherapy. They will carry Wish. They will carry Walls. And they will carry support Pokemon and stuff like that. That's a full stall. The term true stall means they don't have sweepers. This is a team that has built themselves entirely around running Walls, Pokemon who can switch into any situation, have that Pokemon waste their time, throw out a status, and just whittle down the key threats on your team over time. True stall matches last a long, long time, and heaven forbid you put two true stall teams against each other. You're going to see a 300 turn match. It's absolutely ridiculous. But it's a very viable strategy, and you might see it in a lot of singles tournaments that you might go to. So be prepared to break through those. You need wall breaks in order to do that, but you need to be careful of phasers, because these teams will carry Whirlwind, they will carry Roar, and if you start trying to set up on them to sweep through an entire couple of Pokemon, it's not going to work if they're prepared to handle it. So be ready for that. And then weather teams, of course, the Weather War is something that I'm going to go into in another GTT, but be prepared for that too. These Pokemon generate additional speed with Swift Swim in the rain, or Chlorophyll in the sun, or Sandstream in the sand. And I don't think there's like a one for hail, but maybe there is, and I'm just not familiar with it. But these teams can be anything. They could be semi-stall, they could be full stall. No, they couldn't. But be prepared for those type of teams also. They are a big deal also. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to go over, so I'll just go over some closing arguments now. If you want to win more, you need to have answers to the most common Pokemon in the metagame. That's how you win in Pokemon. You can do that while bringing your favorite Pokemon. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to bring Pokemon that you hate and you've played against and you just hate them and all that. You don't need to bring those Pokemon. There are answers. Your favorite Pokemon will be able to do some work in the right areas. My favorite Pokemon, I'll tell you guys right now, that I love to play with is Arcanine. And I found ways to make him work in this really dangerous high stat meta that we're starting to see now with all these mega evolutions. He's still able to put in work, but he requires some team support. I put him on a semi-stall team. I'll go over that team a little bit later. Maybe I'll show it in one of my future videos. But you can make him work. You can still find a way to make those Pokemon function in a different environment, but make sure that you bring additional Pokemon to answer some of these key metagame threats, because these Pokemon are used a lot for a reason. They are very easy win conditions for teams that aren't prepared for them. So make sure that if you have answers for all these Pokemon, make sure you have answers for all these Pokemon, and being competitive against these teams will be much easier for you. People use these Pokemon as much as they do for a reason, so make sure, I'm just going to hammer this into you guys, make sure you're prepared for them, because they'll win matches single-handedly. So I think that's going to be all I'm going to talk about in this GTT. I'm sorry that it was so long. If you guys have any other questions, shoot them in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer them. Or if you have any ideas for the next GTT you'd like to see, throw that in the comments section too. You can add me on Twitter. I'll add that information in the annotations down below. Thank you guys for stopping by. As always, my name is Gym Leader Geo. You guys are the challengers, and I'll see you guys next time.